Red Hat Enterprise Linux is a Linux distribution developed by Red Hat for the commercial market. The company recently announced changes to the availability of its source code. In response, CIQ, Oracle, and SUSE formed the Open Enterprise Linux Association, or OpenELA, which aims to provide a consistent and secure upstream location for enterprise Linux distribution sources. Wim Coekaerts is Executive Vice President of Software Development at Oracle, and he joins the podcast to explain the recent changes in the Linux enterprise space and discuss the OpenELA and its importance to the Linux ecosystem. This episode is hosted by Lee Atchison. Lee Atchison is a software architect, author, and thought leader on cloud computing and application modernization. His best-selling book, Architecting for Scale, is an essential resource for technical teams looking to maintain high availability and manage risk in their cloud environments. Lee is the host of his podcast, Modern Digital Business, produced for people looking to build and grow their digital business. Listen at mdb.fm. Follow Lee at softwarearchitectureinsights.com and see all his content at leeatchison.com.
Wim, welcome to Software Engineering Daily.
Thanks. Glad to be here and look forward to the chat.
Great. So, at a very high level, we'll get into more specifics later, but why don't you start out by just saying, what is OpenELA?
So, in a nutshell, OpenELA is basically, at least initially, three companies, CIQ, SUSE, and Oracle, coming together to create a public workspace to share source code for enterprise Linux compatible distributions. That's fundamentally it. It's the expectation that we all do similar work. And since we do that, or we used to do that independently, now doing this together and publicly makes it a lot easier for us and for everyone else as well. So it's get together, publish source code for enterprise Linux, and anyone else can go and grab it for free, no membership required. But having an association around it helps us be a little bit more formalized so that there's an actual agreement in place and we show commitment to this rather than just saying, hey, yeah, we're going to put some stuff on GitHub and we might just stop. But, so there's really no commitment behind a just project. And that's why a consortium helps and others can then join as well. But fundamentally, it's really just working together to publish source code. That's it.
So how did it get started? How did you guys decide to start working on this? What was the event that got it going?
So we started this last year in June, July, August timeframe when this big enterprise Linux vendor decided to no longer publicly release source code for Linux, for the distribution. And so we continue, or if you look at it, let's take a step back. So Oracle provides Oracle Enterprise Linux or Oracle Linux, and then CIQ uses Rocky, and SUSE has a SUSE version of Enterprise Linux for customers. And we all do our own thing. We are fully compatible with RHEL, and we maintain that compatibility. We provide support for customers. We provide bug fixes, security fixes, and all that stuff. And so as part of what we do, source code was always publicly available at the same time as we release binaries. And then at some point, access to that source code upstream, so to speak, became an issue. And we feel that the source code for the distribution should just be part of it. That's part of the Linux ecosystem. And making that source code only available for subscribers doesn't seem to jive well with the mission of a GPL product, which is what EL is. And so, we have, using Oracle as the example, we obviously have a large support team, we have a large kernel development team, we have a user space development team, we build the distribution, we provide our trademarks and copyrights and, the cute Linux penguin on top, the armored Linux penguin. And we support our customers, and we have all the knowledge in-house to continue doing what we need to do with or without the upstream vendor. Now, in order to do that, we take source code, we take bug fixes, we look at CVEs, we fix these things, and then we publish the source code. So when the upstream vendor made the decision to stop releasing source code, well, we continue what we're doing, then SUSE and CIQ, as two examples, also continue to do what they're doing. We're all going, look, we're all doing exactly the same thing in isolation. It makes a lot more sense to join forces, take what we have, and make it publicly available in a central place. Now, one of the reasons to do that was to avoid more fragmentation. So again, we could all keep doing what we did, but it would be slightly different. And then there's some other vendors out there, or not necessarily vendors commercially, but groups, organizations, and such that also built a clone of EL. And this would create basically 6, 7, 8, 9 different streams of almost the same, not quite the same, everyone doing exactly the same amount of work that they used to. And so working together means we have more freedom to focus on things like quality and ensuring things are done in an expedited way. But also, fragmentation wasn't really good. One of the things, when we at Oracle started Oracle Linux, one of the things we decided was building a completely new Linux distribution was technically, it's not rocket science. It's not hard, it's just work. But what's the advantage of doing something that has a different installer and a different color UI? Fundamentally, it's Linux, and it's, glibc version X and, the kernel version Y, and people want to test something once and not 500 times. And so we decided that, what we wanted to make sure was that customers had choice of support, which fundamentally around these open source projects is really what matters, right? A customer says, I want to use open source products, I want to have the code, but I currently rather pay someone to support me if there's a need for support. But with the option that if I don't like that, then I can keep doing what I'm doing and potentially support it myself. And so that was why we started with compatibility from day one, day zero, really, back in 2006. And so we wanted to continue that. And in order to continue that, we have to do all this work. The other vendors do the same thing. So now we just put it in one place. And one of the things that's also important to note is that while we have the capability to do this, there are lots of vendors out there that build their own Linux appliances with their own software using CentOS in the past /EL as an embedded Linux platform. And so they're now basically dead in the water, or they were for a while, because they're not Linux distribution builders per se. They just need a subset, and they're more focused on their application. And this way we have the ability to provide them and make sure that they have a continued compatible distribution where they don't need to do a lot of work. So it actually helps
a single consistent distribution that works instead of multiple distributions.
That's right.
This portion of Software Engineering Daily is brought to you by Flagsmith. Flagsmith is an open source feature flag software that lets developers release features with confidence. This lets you test in production, stop monster pull requests, and get more control over deployments. It's easy to get set up, whether you're trying feature flags for the first time, are tired of managing them in-house, or are looking to move away from slow development cycles and legacy systems with feature management. You can get up and running for free on SaaS in less than 5 minutes to test feature toggling for your app. Once you're going, click around with out-of-the-box feature flag functionality and easy integrations with tools like Jira without any bloat. For maximum control and flexibility, you can also choose how to deploy Flagsmith. Options include on-premise, self-hosted, SaaS, and private cloud. Try feature flagging for free by visiting flagsmith.com.
So this is all great, but let's get into a basic question first. So I'm sure everyone who's listening is familiar with Linux, but what does enterprise-grade Linux mean? Why is enterprise-grade so important? First, let's talk about from a code standpoint, and then we can talk about support as well. But just from a code standpoint first, what makes Linux enterprise grade versus non-enterprise grade?
So one aspect is testing. So when a new distribution version is released, or when even just new packages are released, there's a large test platform and everything gets QA'd really well, whether it's installation or runtime. But fundamentally, testing is, I would say, one of the top things. Then the second one is rate of change. What ends up happening is that when an enterprise Linux distribution comes out with a new major version, it starts out somewhat freezing the major package levels of every component in there. So when EL9 comes out, and I'm not going to use the right version number, so I'm just going to make up a version number. But let's say Enterprise Linux 9 is released and it uses glibc 2.41 as the main version. Now, what will happen is that through the lifetime of EL9, that version stays the same. Now it'll be 2.41.1, 2.41.10, 2.41 to 20. So the minor version will increase because bug fixes happen, security vulnerability fixes happen, some minor changes happen, but otherwise it stays exactly the same. And the reason for that is because the APIs need to remain the same, so that there's no issue with an application that's built against that 2.41.0, that it will continue to be the same across the entire lifetime for EL9. And I think that from a pure code point of view, that's the most important part, is maintaining versions, maintaining code compatibility and APIs, and not introduce change that can cause disruption, that can cause hangs or crashes in an application that runs, so that an enterprise-grade vendor that builds a large application knows that for that lifetime it will continue to work and they don't have to do new stuff. And for something like the Oracle database, as being a big application that runs on Linux, that's absolutely critical. If everyone constantly were to update packages in between, then package update could break the database, could break a bank from processing credit card transactions, and so there needs to be stability in terms of versioning.
Right. And pretty much all enterprise-grade Linuxes do that. And RHEL was really Red Hat Enterprise Linux was the main base for all enterprise Linux, for your versions, for everyone else's version on top of that until recently. But now, rather than being a base, they're more of a competitor. Is that a fair statement?
That's an interesting way of putting it. So I think we've always been competitors because we compete on support quality. We wanted to make sure that we maintain the same code base, and that's still happening. So even though these changes happened last summer, we continue to be fully compatible, and that's a high priority for us. We don't want to deviate that. We want to maintain that compatibility, but we still continue to compete on support quality, on how quickly we can address problems if a customer runs into it, having a focus on enterprise software, which is still the same as many years ago when we started. So it's important to maintain compatibility because ISVs don't want to certify in many different versions. So if they know that it's the same, they can pick one to certify on, and it will work on all these other derivatives as well. And we compete on support quality and cost.
So are you saying that OpenELA, even though it's split from RHEL, is really still maintaining backward compatibility with RHEL in all aspects?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So what we do is we work together to ensure that when a RHEL update happens, that we will provide the same update and put the source code on OpenELA on the GitHub repo. But number one priority is provide public source code for the exact same code.
This episode of Software Engineering Daily is brought to you by Vantage. Do you know what your cloud bill will be for this month? For many companies, cloud costs are the number 2 line item in their budget and the number 1 fastest growing category of spend. Vantage helps you get a handle on your cloud bills with self-serve reports and dashboards built for engineers, finance, and operations teams. With Vantage, you can put costs in the hands of the service owners and managers who generate them, giving them budgets, alerts, anomaly detection, and granular visibility into every dollar. With native billing integrations with dozens of cloud services, including AWS, Azure, GCP, Datadog, Snowflake, and Kubernetes, Vantage is the one FinOps platform to monitor and reduce all your cloud bills. To get started, head to vantage.sh, connect your accounts, and get a free savings estimate as part of a 14-day free trial.
So the general process now is Red Hat makes an update and they make it available to their customers. The APIs are made available, but the source code is not. But then OpenELA will make those same changes to make their version compatible with RHEL, but they make their changes available open source on the public repository for anyone to have access to. What has changed and what's the difference that's going on here?
That's exactly correct. So source code for RHEL is now available for paying customers and not other people. And so we make that code available to everyone. Now, one thing to keep in mind also is that when it comes to a Linux distribution, the source code is publicly available and bug fixes are done typically upstream. So Linux kernel fixes go to Linux and go into the latest kernel, and then they get backported. Bug fixes for glibc and all that stuff, the same thing. And so it's not like there is any proprietary code in any RHEL or EL or OL. It's all public source code anyway. Now, when something gets backported, then we might have access to source code for a newer version that we then backport to the older version, the same way as what, let's say Red Hat would do. But it's the same code. We have access to the same patches and all that.
So all the packages that are, all of the changes made to base Linux are available to both you and to Red Hat and everyone else. But seems like there's something that RHEL is doing in there that they don't want to have exposed anymore. Do you know what that is? What is their motivation? Like, here I'm asking you, but I am asking you. I am talking to you, so I'd love your opinion. And I know it's just that, but what is it that drove Red Hat to go the direction of more closed source?
So, like I said, I can't speak for them, so I don't know exactly what happened, but I can tell you the following, right? We compete for customers. We have been doing that since 2006. And so does CIQ and SUSE, right? There's not that many enterprise Linux distributions out there that are used, in production, and there's not a huge amount of choice. So we compete on support. We charge X amount, Red Hat charges Y, and CIQ, I don't know what they charge, but they charge money as well. So fundamentally, we go to customers and, we say, hey, if you come to Oracle, then you have all these benefits. We understand enterprises. We understand enterprise customers. We're global. We're in all the different languages. We know backend databases really well. So if you run enterprise apps, our support team knows all this stuff. Red Hat/IBM have their goal and their messages towards customers. And so we're competing. One thing that happened way back when, so this is sort of an evolution, in 2010, 2011, one thing that happened was the source code for the Linux kernel in enterprise Linux was always the base Linux version, let's say, 4.14, and then a bunch of files that were the patches applied on top of that base version. So that was really easy for developers to understand the changes that happened on a regular basis. And so one of the changes that they made back then was to basically create a tarball of the code where the base kernel plus all the patches were applied, and only that was provided to anyone. And so the idea behind it was, it makes it more difficult for people to understand what the patches are, and so support is harder. And, for us, we have great kernel developers. We don't really care, but that was sort of the intent. And so there's been a gradual attempt at making it difficult for other vendors to build an compatible equivalent distribution. And, this was sort of the next step in that evolution.
Right. That makes sense. So that's fundamentally the difference between you and RHEL isn't anything having to do with the implementation or the software or the system itself. It's the philosophy for how it's built and how it's put together. You're doing the work independently, producing the same result and different deliverables to your customers or to the community, not necessarily to customers. Yeah.
Yeah, more so now than before, but it's still about providing support.
Customer support is the key. That's the real value add that you're putting on top of everything else. And that is where you're truly unique, or where each vendor is truly unique, is how they do customer support. Yeah.
That's right.
As a listener of Software Engineering Daily, you understand the impact of generative AI. On the podcast, we've covered many exciting aspects of Gen AI technologies, as well as the new vulnerabilities and risks they bring. HackerOne's AI red teaming addresses the novel challenges of AI safety and security for businesses launching new AI deployments. Their approach involves stress testing AI models and deployments to make sure they can't be tricked into providing information beyond their intended use, and that security flaws can't be exploited to access confidential data or systems. Within the HackerOne community, over 750 active hackers specialize in prompt hacking and other AI security and safety testing. In a single recent engagement, a team of 18 HackerOne hackers quickly identified 26 valid findings within the initial 24 hours and accumulated over 100 valid findings in the 2-week engagement. HackerOne offers strategic flexibility, rapid deployment, and a hybrid talent strategy. Learn more at hackerone.com/AI. That's HACKERONE.com/AI.
Let's talk about one of the things you often hear about in conversations about open source. Now, I'm talking general open source here, not just Linux, not just enterprise Linux, but one of the things you hear is, does open source contribute to higher security in software, or does it compromise security in software? And there's all sorts of philosophical views either direction, and it's an interesting debate in and of itself and probably worth multiple episodes just on that topic. But how does OpenELA think about enterprise-grade security in light of the open nature of what it produces?
Actually, it's a great question. And there's no one answer to it. Like you said, it could be many episodes. I think if I were to give my 2 cents on this, first of all, it sort of depends on the project. Right? One of the things that tends to happen is an open source project is built by 1 or 2 people. They're very active in it. And then after a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever happens in their lives, they take a step back. And so, or they're the main contributor of the code, and then they take a step back. And there's a void and nobody picks up. When something like that happens to a project, then it becomes more vulnerable to potential security risks, right? Because nobody is paying attention to it. And the Linux Foundation, as you might have heard, has been working on some of this stuff, trying to see, they provide grants to important core infrastructure projects to ensure that there's other people participate, or there's enough hardware available for testing and so forth. And OpenSSL was a good example where, it was sort of slowing down and obviously very critical. And then with the help of the LF and some companies, it kind of picked itself back up. And so that's one part. And so you arguably, security there became an issue, but that's no different than a company that has a product where they're spending less time on it and are not maintaining it. So the open source nature of that is less important than the funding and amount of time individuals have on that project to work on it. Now, the other part is, as one often says, when development is done in the open and code check-ins, certainly on the Linux kernel, code check-ins are viewed by hundreds, if not thousands of people. So it's really difficult to get something past that environment that hasn't had many eyes on it. And the concept, certainly on the Linux kernel, the concept of having signed off by in the review process, it's pretty diligent. It's not that one developer has direct access to check something into the Git tree from Linux. It first has to go to the maintainer. The maintainer checks it in, sends it to Linux, who then actually commits it. So there are multiple gates for code to go in, and there is a good review. So some of those projects are very secure. Some of them, we kind of have to take a look at each of them. When it comes to OpenELA, one thing to keep in mind is that in the Linux and open source ecosystem, certainly in the Linux distribution space, there has been forever a mail list / group of people from distribution vendors that work together on agreeing on embargo dates for open source project security vulnerabilities. Because if something is discovered in, say, SUSE, and they release the source code for a bug fix but don't tell anyone else, then everyone else is vulnerable until we find out and then fix it in our version or something like that. And so what's happened forever is that, there's somebody from Oracle on there, somebody from SUSE, from Red Hat, from Ubuntu, and even from BSD in some of these groups. And so when a vulnerability is found in an open source package, then it gets reported within that group privately. And then everyone agrees on one, who's going to work on the fix, or who already might have one, and two, what everyone agrees to in terms of embargo date. Since we're already part of that, this benefits OpenELA because we make sure that we are in the know. If something happens in Red Hat Enterprise Linux, we know that there's some vulnerability fix coming. So we're not going to be caught off guard. And since we have to fix this for our customers anyway, and it goes into the OpenELA source code, then OpenELA becomes equally safe, secure.
Makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So how is the work that goes on in OpenELA different than the work that you're doing within Oracle itself on your enterprise edition? Is the difference just your support, or is there more involved?
So I would say OpenELA is a place where we publish the source code, full stop. There's not necessarily work happening within OpenELA that's unique to that. We work on code for Oracle Linux when we have the source code for that, and it's something that gets released, then that goes into OpenELA. If the CIQ folks are doing something before us and they release it, it goes into OpenELA, and we use the same thing. So OpenELA is really more of a source code repo where we stuff the code that we provide to our users and customers and developers out there. So it's not like we have to fund people to do work for OpenELA. It's the work we do that we publish publicly. Yeah.
Right. So it may be some different language. OpenELA isn't making the changes. The companies that are part of OpenELA make the changes and share them among everyone who's part of the OpenELA ecosystem.
That's right. So it's a very low cost association because we don't need to hire developers there. We're the developers on our own. And of course, it's public, right? And so if a developer out there is playing with the OpenELA source code and building their own thing and finds a bug or something, they can certainly report that bug through that platform and we'll pick it up, or they can release the patch and we'll pick it up. So it is a project where we do want people to participate and work as a community because everything makes stuff better. But our first goal is we have code, we publish it there. We have documentation that we've published there as well, because part of a Linux distribution is having documentation for the product. And so we've built documentation for many years, and we've contributed that back to the OpenELA as well, so that it's unbranded generic documentation.
Open documentation, yeah. So you actually bring up something that I wanted to get into, so it's actually pretty good timing, and that is, so you, SUSE, CIQ, all contribute your changes to what is OpenELA, and correct me if I got the language not quite right with that, but basically that's what goes on. And anyone else can contribute as well. So that the $1 million question is, who else contributes? Who is contributing? Are there other companies who are contributing? Are there individuals that are contributing? Do you have a large community of contributors, or is it mostly the three principals?
Right now, it's mostly us. It takes some time for others to really get involved and engaged in it. But I think that will happen over time as people feel more comfortable with it. You have to understand that in the past, there was CentOS, right? And CentOS has kind of changed its mission from being compatible to being, let's call it upstream. So you're always, when you run CentOS now, you're sort of ahead of the game. But ahead of the game is not good when you build something stable and want enterprise-grade code to run your applications on, which is why CentOS has been moving that direction. It's to no longer be an alternative as a runtime for production, unfortunately. And that's one aspect of what we're trying to do is if you build your code off of OpenELA, then you maintain that stability and quality. And so there isn't that many folks that are currently building off of this tree, but there's certainly a lot of marketing around it and making sure, like I said, the reason we started this quickly was to ensure we reduced the potential of fragmentation, because as soon as this announcement went out, there were lots of different private threads between different groups to say, hey, we'll do our own and we'll do our own and this is where we're going. And so when we came together, we said, look, let's get the message out first before the association existed, before we we had the source code repos up. We just want to make sure we're going to work together and people don't have to be worried, because there was a lot of concern, oh, what's going to happen with enterprise Linux now? We're like, look, we're behind this. We're committed long term. We want compatibility. Don't worry. You're safe. There's a alternative if you're concerned. And so then we started doing all these other pieces. And now that, in the last few months and certainly last few weeks, even more, now that these repos are up and more changes are coming up, you'll see more folks starting to use it. And I think in the next months, hopefully this calendar year, more folks will participate. But I have to say, it's really more about stability for customers. It's a message to the public. And if nobody contributes, we will continue to do that. We don't need more contributions. We certainly welcome them without having to be paying any money or something like that, but it's not required.
So it sounds like, so you're in the uptake phase, right? And you're getting people to buy in. And basically one of the biggest values you've provided is nothing more than the message that you're doing this adds stability to an already destabilized situation, given the announcements by Red Hat. So given that, this may not be an easy or even for that matter, a fair question, just because I'm not sure how to answer it, but what is the acceptance of OpenELA like? How has it been received, and how do you see it growing over the next year or so?
So I think in general, it's been positive. I do think that the main message of providing users out there a sense of stability and a level of comfort has certainly worked. I can tell you that in last year in June, July, lots of customers were like, oh no, what does this mean? What's going to happen? And so by jumping on it the way we did with the three companies, and also, individually, we've always had the message of if they disappear from the face of the earth tomorrow, we have the right folks to continue. We are fully capable to continue our own way. And that, of course, was still the case, but the intent of maintaining compatibility has always been important. And so by being able to do that, I think our primary message of reducing concern has worked. I haven't had any conversations with customers in months that even asked about this. The whole conversation kind of disappeared. The confusion and the concern disappeared quickly after all of these announcements. And life goes on as usual, basically. And so in the future, it's the same thing. We will continue on our mission, and we will have a place where we can create new repositories with new projects that can be added on top, not to modify existing stuff. The base will always be the same and fully compatible, but for people to start experimenting with stuff and having broader access for ISVs or others to build their own things on top.
So you actually went right into my next question, which was, OpenELA 2024 is essentially a don't worry, everything's fine message. What's OpenELA 2025 and what's OpenELA 2026?
Well, primary goal is don't worry, everything will continue as is. And that will continue. That's the core mission, right?
But it does sound like there are some capabilities that you're working on that you intend to extend into OpenELA that will make it different from Red Hat's implementation.
That's right, because people want to have a way to experiment with, let's say, a new version of the kernel. And so instead of having to go with a Linux distribution that's completely different with every package being different, you can then say, okay, I install the base version and the only thing I change is the Linux kernel package, and I try something out. If it doesn't work, I just go back and reboot into the original one. But it gives me a chance to have a stable distribution that I can build on and then experiment with taking one or two components out of it and see if that works or not. So it makes it a little bit easier to do new stuff and try things out without breaking everything.
Right. So what are some of the things that you see that will be added to OpenELA in the upcoming years?
So, newer versions of the Linux kernel, I think, would be primary because a lot of the innovation happens on the kernel side. So I think that would be a very good example. And I think mostly add-ons like building additional packages and projects that are not part of the base code, that we create a repo for special tools that Otherwise, you'd have to build yourself, and they could be coming from the OpenEL repos, for instance, high performance computing stuff. So it really is more about individuals saying, hey, I built this new thing. I want to have the enterprise customers use this. And so if I publish this on the OpenELA site, then it can be built and we know it runs on EL. I think it's more that.
So it's the differences are going to be, not saying this word derogatorily, but a hodgepodge of different packages based on what people are working on and want to contribute, as opposed to a strategic direction change or a strategic direction that OpenELA is headed. There's no direction you're trying to take OpenELA. OpenELA's strategic direction is don't worry, be happy.
Yeah.
But there's no strategic direction beyond that you're identifying.
That's correct. It's basically stability, don't worry, be happy. We maintain compatibility. And if we didn't do anything but that, we achieve our mission.
Still, naturally, as time goes on, OpenELA and Red Hat Enterprise Linux will probably start to separate at some level, right? Whether it's because of additional packages that are added or different decisions that are made by various companies, including Red Hat, including yourself. There's going to be deviation as time goes on. Do you see them deviating to the point where they're different to the point where, different the way other versions of Linux are different from each other? Do you see that happening, or do you really want that not to happen?
I would say, and I think I can speak for the other folks involved in this as well, for the most part, we want to maintain the same code. And that's definitely our goal. Fragmentation doesn't help anything or anyone. That's not the purpose. That wasn't the purpose of why we went on our end, in the Linux support business anyway. It really is about having stability and having fewer things to test and less deviation. Now, if something does happen where proprietary becomes even more proprietary, I don't even know to what point that's possible at this point, because it's already pretty far off the main path of open source. So if something worse were to happen, so to speak, then it might happen. But I'm not sure why they would want to go there, because that seems pretty extreme. So I'm pretty comfortable with the current direction.
So Oracle or the OpenELA consortium, I'm not sure if consortium is the right word, but whatever word you want to use there, doesn't want to do deviation. You can't speak for Red Hat what they want to do, but you don't anticipate them wanting to either. So you really hope and believe to be true that they'll be compatible from a software standpoint, and that the deviations are going to be in the business value on top of the software, support, testing, all those sorts of things for the foreseeable future.
That's correct. And, of course, who knows what happens? I guess nobody can predict the future there, and what potential other thing could come out of the minds of the folks, in terms of restricting access to code. I would say, if someday there would be a real restriction on our ability to do what we do, then OpenELA will provide a joint path forward, even if it were to, let's say, fork or deviate from, at some point, forced, then we would continue. And so that would create, I guess, a deviation, but then it would be a joint deviation rather than everyone on their own. So it would still be better than the alternative.
How have the cloud providers, the AWSs, the Azure, the GCPs, and yourselves, what has their reaction been to this whole environment, both with what went on with RHEL as well as what's going on with OpenELA?
There hasn't been that much change. So a couple of things. One is that most of the cloud vendors do not provide the distribution they use for their cloud. They have their own internal thing. So not exposed to something like that necessarily. And as such, don't really care. Customers run whatever they want on their cloud platform. And the third parties certify against, their distribution, or they build images. And we build Oracle Linux images, and SUSE builds SLAS, and CIQ builds Rocky, and that's available in all the different cloud vendors' marketplaces anyway. And so from a pure cloud vendor point of view, it wasn't really affecting them as much at all. And so, life continues. I think it really was hurting the customers that felt that they suddenly were exposed, and now they're less exposed. But that exposure was more running the distribution, whether that was on premises or in a cloud. It wasn't really any different.
Got it. So what's next I'll ask the question twice. Once for what's next for you related to OpenELA, and what's next for Oracle in this area?
Next for OpenELA is continuing ensuring we release the source code and show people that this is real and that we are committed to this and maintain that reduction of risk or eliminating the risk concern. And working more on a broader ecosystem around, like I said, documentation and providing test suites. If somebody else wants to run some tests on their own and we have some tests, we'll make them available. The documentation, I think, is quite useful because if you build a distribution, you do want to provide some level of docs with it. And so we've already built a lot of that, so contributing that back is helpful. So I think it's just really cleaning up the little rough edges that we need to do and just having a very clear, consistent release model, same day, no delays in source code access to OpenELA versus what we do, all that stuff. And be very transparent on everything. The code, the commits, the downloads are free, public, no login, stuff like that. In terms of Oracle and Oracle Linux, we have a great customer base. We use Oracle Linux everywhere inside Oracle in our own appliances, the database appliances and Exadata and such that we ship to customers have been OL forever. And so our focus is really the Linux part, the Linux distribution part is a very well-oiled machine. We continue building packages and updates and the compatibility stays. Our main focus is, and has always been, make the upstream Linux kernel better because there's always new chips, there's new now with GPUs and faster storage and different types of storage. So we do a lot of work upstream that goes into Linux's kernel and then trickles back into our kernel and the enterprise Linux kernel. So that is basically continuing what we have been doing in the past and no real change. So pretty stable.
Well, thank you very much for this time. This has been a great conversation. Obviously I'd heard about OpenELA last year, but I didn't know a lot about it or what it really meant. So I think this is going to help a lot of people figure out really what it is and what type of role it might play in their future.
Okay.
So,
well, my pleasure.
Wim Coekaerts is the Executive Vice President of Software Development at Oracle and a leader in the OpenELA project. And he's been my guest today. Wim, thank you for joining me today on Software Engineering Daily. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. Have a nice day.